This video comes from Paint Coach, my 10 best oil painting tips to instantly improve your paintings. Hopefully this will help you out. Hopefully you can take something from this. We're gonna find out whether or not any of these will instantly improve your painting.
All right, let's start with tip number 1, which is use what I call a mini grid. I do this a lot in my Patreon tutorials to help people follow along drawing, and I'll put a line dividing the canvas in half vertically and then again horizontally. And just having these two center lines can make drawing so much easier.
There is a way to actually do this from life. There's these little boxes you can use that will act as that sort of grid structure, so you can actually see through this little cutout box with lines on there, and you can hold it up to look at your model. So it is possible to do this from life as well. How much does it help? I'm not entirely sure. I guess if you're a beginner, it would definitely help just to get this general idea of how to proportion things. The other thing I would suggest on that note is to find some sort of more mathematical ways to approach drawing and painting. So I have a video actually demonstrating exactly that on my Patreon. That's at patreon.com/Nick Thurman. There's a lot of tutorials out there, so feel free to search on the internet and just find some of these structures. Understanding that structure, how to proportion things in general, will be very helpful.
All right, tip number 2 is use a value underpainting, or what I call a value map. A lot of times when I start a painting and I feel that the values are going to get tricky once I introduce color, I'll block in the entire scene with a neutral wash of whatever color I drew in the subject. A lot of times this is a mix of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. You know, some people do it with just burnt sienna. Whatever you like to do an underpainting with, just make sure to be only using the paint thinner and keeping the paint relatively thin here, because we do have to paint over top of this.
So I don't totally agree with that. I'm not a fan of these like more neutral underpaintings per se. I would just suggest that once you start painting right away, you know, in the first layer, start using thin paint, as you mentioned. Start using more reduced colors. That's all great, but I don't like that sort of white. You know, just reduce your palette. Don't use so many colors. I like to use a sort of umber created by mixing orange with black, and then a little bit of a warmer, lighter flesh tone. So the value range is still going to be there. You're going to be able to get a lot of values, but it's a little bit subdued. It's more towards gray. So I do think that is helpful, to not use so many particular colors. For example, don't use that yellow or that red by itself in the first layer, but just simplify. You don't have to make these, you know, grisaille type underpaintings in order to simplify.
But just mapping out the values, even if it is just one value for dark, one value for light, that can be a huge help. It can help guide you once you start putting colors in. It can also just help with the simplification process. Being forced to simplify the scene in a few amount of values can be a big help as well.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, I totally agree with that. What he said there is a good point, because I think you should be working on a, you know, oil ground prepared canvas, and then you've already got your mid-tone there. You've got that nice flesh color. So really all you need is a solid shadow color, and then you need some sort of lighter color to put these kind of highlight accents in place. So you don't really need more than, I don't know, 2 or 3 different colors on your palette when you're getting started on that first layer.
All right, tip number 3. When you're blocking out the big shapes at the beginning of your painting, try to always err on the darker side of the color value that you're using. This mainly comes into play when you're blocking out lighter areas. A lot of times I see people block out the lighter shapes a little too bright, and they have to go back in and darken it. I always say it's a lot easier to lighten paint on the canvas as you go, opposed to darkening it. It's also just easier to lay on lighter, thicker paint as you go. If you start with a really light value, it's gonna give you nowhere to really build. I mean, the painting can still work, it's just gonna be a little more difficult.
You know, that's a good tip. I totally agree with that. If you err on the side of going just a little bit darker, it's generally going to work out really well. It's going to look very compelling. As you saw, once you started to get some of those colors in there, you know, the whole painting started to come to life in a way. It doesn't take much light, and you don't need to really get a lot of light in the painting in order to make it compelling and to make it feel like it's alive. So generally, err on the side of making it a little bit darker.
I always like to think of it as if I am painting with cutout paper and I have to use big solid shapes, getting smaller and smaller with my shapes as I go. So like if I wanted to paint a sphere, I would start with a relatively dark circle, and then I'd add a slightly smaller, lighter circle, and then another slightly smaller and lighter circle within that, and then the final highlight within that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the basic way to approach painting. You gotta simplify, look at these different colors and values in a very simple way, and just try to use as few as possible. Then as you start to work through the process, you can refine, you can blend those edges together, start to get more particular. But just having a simple understanding, being able to do something like this, is absolutely crucial to making great paintings.
Tip number 4, stand back from your easel when you're painting. I know it sounds so simple and it seems like it's a throwaway piece of advice, but I guarantee you, if you constantly are stepping back, you're constantly painting with your arm fully extended, it's gonna keep you from making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, this is great. I like this guy already. This is great advice. Stepping back, it's gonna help you to see that sort of general shape, and you're not gonna be so focused on the details. Like he said, keep your arm extended. If you have your arm out and you're painting with your brush a little bit from a distance, you're focusing on those general shapes. What that's gonna do is it's gonna help to make sure you get the big shapes in place. You're gonna get the structure really solid, and that's absolutely crucial. It's gonna do so much more for you than getting all of these little details. You're gonna get that big structure laid down without any real complications, and it's just gonna be much more solid.
Tip number 5, I see this a lot in students' work. If your colors don't seem to be too vibrant, like they just seem kind of grayed out, and your shadows don't have a lot of color or vibrancy to them, and you have burnt umber or black on your palette, get rid of them. I found a lot when students have black or burnt umber on their palette, they just always go to those to darken whatever color they have. Doing that is going to keep you from really seeing color, especially in dark shadow areas, to see what colors are really happening. How do you use the primaries to get a really dark color?
So I agree with him to a certain level. I don't think you should get rid of your black, but if you're working with the Apellis palette, you're not gonna have some of these unnecessary colors on your palette anyways. Instead, what I would suggest is that when you're working in the shadows, you should almost always be using much warmer and more colorful shadows than what you anticipate. You should use a lot of brown, a lot of gray, and use those to your advantage rather than trying to make the shadows black. Basically, just don't make the shadows black. If you're going to use that black, it's got to be in a few very concentrated areas. And the other thing I would say, if you're finding that your colors don't have much vibrancy, you should probably go in the opposite direction. So if your painting is very orange, you have a lot of orange, and yet it doesn't feel warm, it's because you don't have any coolness. You need to get some of that gray, some of that Apellis blue or cooler colors, and get some of that in your painting in order to create contrast. That's really what it comes down to. If your colors aren't going to stand out, it's because they don't have anything to contrast against. So I suggest using plenty of gray to contrast your orange.
All right, tip number 6 is use daylight temperature light to paint your paintings in. This could just be light coming in from a window. If you are using lights because you got to paint at night or just lighten up your studio, try and get daylight bulbs. You just really want to keep the light that you paint in and that your palettes in, your canvases in, and all that consistent.
Agreed. You want to keep it consistent. That's why I prefer artificial lights over any kind of natural light setup. It's just usually more reliable, more consistent. And then on top of that, I would actually have a bigger suggestion, which is to make sure you have sufficient lighting. That's usually the biggest problem I've found, is that a lot of people work with some kind of house light, some little light in the ceiling, and it's just not going to light up your painting properly. You're not going to get enough light. It's not going to be the right kind of light either. As he mentioned, daylights work great. So what I suggest is softbox lights. Make sure you get plenty of light coming onto your canvas and onto your palette. You're going to be able to see all the problems, and then no matter where you go, if you take that into a dimmer setting, it's still going to look good. If you do the reverse, if you have a very dimly lit painting and then you take it into a brighter setting, it's going to suddenly reveal many problems you couldn't see in that very dim setting.
All right, tip number 7 is don't work from photos.
Don't work from photos. I totally agree.
Now, tip number 8, this is actually something I've never talked about before. Focus on one aspect of painting or aspect of a subject matter until you get a better understanding of it.
That's a great tip right there. That's a great tip. That's what I suggest as well. Focus on something very particular because it's much easier to improve that. And if you just do that step by step, suddenly you're going to have massive improvements across the board. So if you try to compare to a masterwork, for example, it may be very complex. You may find massive differences between your painting and the masterwork, but if you isolate and focus on specific qualities, like just the contrast or even just the contrast around the eye, you're going to be able to actually copy that and imitate it and use it in your own painting. So if you simplify in that way, it's much easier to grasp, it's much easier to implement and to learn.
All right, tip number 9, don't think of gray as a color. What do I mean by that? I mean, gray isn't a color. I always like to think of a color and it being grayish or grayed down. Like a lot of people would look at some clouds and it's like, oh, those clouds are gray. I would say, no, those clouds are a grayed down purple or a grayed down blue. Always try to identify a real color first and then gray it down using its complement.
That's pretty good advice. I also like that he said you gray something down by using its complement. So, for example, if your painting is going a little bit too orange, then you need to get some more blue type of color in there. You need to cool it down. If you're getting too red, if something is too red, you need to use green, and the green is going to actually cool it down. So that's going to be a very helpful idea to consider. If you're going to use those grays, they should be placed with some sort of consideration. The areas where you're usually going to find gray are going to be pretty consistent, and you can find these sort of commonalities. Just as you find red in the lips and around the nose, you're going to find certain areas in the painting where you have more of that gray, and it's going to skew more towards green, more towards blue, more towards red or yellow. So just consider that when you're working on your painting. You want to simplify as much as possible, but once you get into these more particular stages, you can consider these things and start to think about how you're going to actually cool down particular areas or desaturate particular areas.
Put more paint on your palette. Now, I know this probably sounds like a throwaway tip. Oh, okay, Chris, put more paint on your palette. What's that gonna do? In my experience and observation, more students than not don't put enough paint on their palette.
Totally agree. I've seen the same thing. If you're just working with like the littlest amount of paint, little tiny bit of paint, and you're trying to mix that onto your brush and put it onto the canvas, of course you're gonna struggle to get bold, confident marks. Of course you're going to struggle to build impasto. You're going to struggle to paint directly and to really cover the surface just because you don't have enough paint. So that is a common problem I've seen. Having that paint there is going to make sure you can actually make substantial marks and really get what you want. On top of that, it's very annoying to refill your palette. It's very annoying to get that. Once you get started, it's annoying to go and get paint and put the paint back on there. So if you just have it to begin with, I think it's going to do you a lot of good, and you're going to be able to just keep working and not have to get distracted. And I've done it myself. I'll admit, I've done it myself, where I've just been lazy. I didn't want to go find the paint to refill my palette, so I just kept working, and therefore my painting skewed in a certain direction that I didn't really intend, just because I was too lazy to get the paint and put it on my palette. I would also recommend you pre-mix your essential colors. Your essential colors should be pre-mixed. That way you don't have to sit there with your palette knife and prepare your palette every single time you want to paint. Just get the colors, mix them up, put them into a tube, and now when you go to paint, you don't have to worry about mixing up that flesh color. You can just squeeze it straight out of the tube. It's right there, you're ready to go. So there you go. There's 10 tips to immediately improve your painting. I think he offered a lot of great advice. I particularly like taking distance from your painting. Taking distance, that's a lot of things that painters, especially in that kind of beginner to intermediate level, just starting out, they don't really think about that or do that, but it's going to help you to simplify. That would be my big piece of advice, is to simplify, make things easier for yourself. So thank you, Paint Coach, for the tips. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments. If there's a video you want me to react to, let me know. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.